All right. Just a word of announcement. This will be the third of 3 sessions. So we're wrapping up this series today. And I direct your attention to a series that's going to unfold throughout February in honor of Black History Month. We're going to be featuring 3 prominent Black Nashvillians who are recounting the history of African Americans in Nashville and defines what a path towards true racial justice in our community might look like. We'll be welcoming Dr. Lee Williams for 2 talks next Sunday and next Thursday night on this history. We'll also be welcoming Deacon Bill Hill, formerly from St. Vincent de Paul Parish, now in Holy Family in Brentwood, to talk both about Catherine Drexel and the foundation of the Black Church in the South, and also desegregation here in the 60s. And also Paige Courtney Barnes, a young writer and catechist in the diocese, who's written quite a bit about what it's like to be a young Black Catholic trying to find herself in the church. So you can find all of these, all the information in the Zoom registration on our website and on the weekly emails if you get those. So please stay tuned for lots more good stuff. In a preface to the Pontifical Biblical Commission's document, The Jewish People and Their Sacred Scriptures in the Christian Bible, which was released in 2001, Joseph Ratzinger wrote the following. In its work, the Biblical Commission could not ignore the contemporary context, where the shock of the Shoah, or the Holocaust, has put the whole question under a new light. 2 main problems are posed. Can Christians, after all that has happened, still claim in good conscience to be the legitimate heirs of Israel's Bible? Have they the right to propose a Christian interpretation of this Bible? Or should they not instead respectfully and humbly renounce any claim that, in the light of what has happened, must look like a usurpation? The second question follows from the first. In its presentation of the Jews and the Jewish people, has not the New Testament itself contributed to creating a hostility towards the Jewish people that provided a support for the ideology of those who wished to destroy Israel? The Commission set about addressing those 2 questions. It is clear that a Christian rejection of the Old Testament would not only put an end to Christianity itself, as indicated above, but in addition would prevent the fostering of positive relations between Christians and Jews, precisely because they would lack common ground. In light of what has happened, what ought to emerge now is a new respect for the Jewish interpretation of the Old Testament. Returning today to help us foster such a respect is New Testament scholar and parishioner Ricky Shinall, who will be concluding this series by discussing the role of the writings in Jesus' ministry and preaching. So Ricky, thank you and welcome once more.
Great, thanks for having me again. Let me do the often perilous screen sharing trick. All right, y'all see my PowerPoint? Yeah, all right, let's see if we can make it big. Okay, so thank you again for that introduction, John. I have loved each of the 3 introductions that you've given me. I think they've been really helpful framing what we're going about here. So as John said, today will be the 3rd and final talk in our series about the Old Testament in the Gospels. And just to remind you, we have sort of had to structure this, have adopted the threefold structure that Jews have sort of placed on their Bible, what we would call the Old Testament. And so the first week we talked about Torah, the second week we talked about the prophets, and then this week we'll talk about the books known as the writings. And as you can see there, the writings is sort of an eclectic kind of catch-all group of books. There's less sort of thematic coherence within this grouping than there is within, for instance, the Torah or within the prophets. So there's not as many sort of like overarching or repetitive kind of themes from this mass as a whole. It's more of kind of looking at individual books and individual cases of how they're used in the New Testament. And I think fortunately, two of the most kind of impactful books in the Gospels are within the writings, which are the Book of Psalms and the Book of Daniel. So we'll take kind of in turn, just looking at some examples from each of those books and how they show up in the New Testament. In the Gospels, particularly, both as ways that the narrators structure their stories, and as things that Jesus explicitly or implicitly talks about himself within those stories. So we'll start with the Psalms, which are, of course, kind of the hymn book of ancient Israel. So it's a collection of songs that have a whole lot of different types of themes that they talk about. There are psalms of rejoicing. There are psalms of lament, one of which we'll look at closely. So sad psalms of praise to God, psalms that sort of are glorifying the king or the royal family of Israel, one of which we'll look at. So it's an incredibly variegated book in terms of the things that these songs deal with. And it's pretty clear that by Jesus' time, the Psalms were sort of an important and intrinsic part of Judaism, and that they were used in sort of communal activities of singing, and you can think kind of just as how deeply meaningful religious music is to people. I think, nowadays, I think is a helpful way of thinking about the Psalms, right? That the language from hymns that are very kind of, famous or meaningful to us tend to be like some of the most evocative religious language that we can use, and really sort of connect on a really sort of deep emotional, spiritual level to people in a way that often sort of more kind of prosaic or written religious language doesn't really connect with. And so we can see in the Psalms are probably not as prominent in the Gospels as a whole as, for instance, the Torah is or the prophets are. But there are a few places where the Psalms come up that's actually really, really important. And so even though the kind of volume but in which the Psalms come into the New Testament is not as sort of impressive as stuff from the Pentateuch or the prophets, where it does come up tends to be like a very important part. And so I think the most important place in the Gospels where the Psalms are influencing is actually in the crucifixion narrative itself, and in Psalm 22. So these are just some excerpts from Psalm 22. Psalm 22 is what's known as a lament psalm. So as I said, there are various different types of psalms. One of the types of psalms was what's known as a lament psalm, which is what it sounds like. It's a sort of a song about how sad you are about something and sort of crying out to God in your distress about the hardships of your situation, and sort of hoping God will hear your lament and sort of rectify the situation. And so Psalm 22, if you read the whole thing, it's clearly about someone who has been very faithful to God, but has fallen on very hard times and has really sort of lost all of their friends and much of their much of their property and is now like very poor and hungry, and complaining about that. And it's basically a lament of this situation of this person who's been faithful to God, but who's still nevertheless suffered a lot of misfortune and is having a lot of physical suffering. In some senses, you can think of it as like somewhat similar to the book of Job in that sense of it's sort of a righteous person's lament about the physical misfortunes that they're suffering. And read on its own, that just sort of seems to be what it is. It's sort of one person's, very poetic and very moving struggle with misfortune in the face of their own righteousness. But one of the things that we see, and that I've chosen these excerpts to really illustrate, is how the language and ideas of Psalm 22 are really taken up into the narratives of the crucifixion in all four Gospels. And I think this is something that's important and notable. One, just because the crucifixion is such a theologically important part of the Christian tradition, right? Like that's why our symbol is crosses. But also from a kind of historical standpoint, the narratives around the passion and the crucifixion tend to be the things that are most similar amongst the four Gospels. So in other words, it seems like the story about Jesus' arrest, trial, crucifixion were some of the earliest parts of the Christian tradition to really sort of congeal and to be a story that then all four of the Gospels tell in very similar ways. Whereas in other parts of the Gospel, there's a lot of, orders are different, or they don't all tell the same stories, but all four Gospels tell the passion narrative in a really consistent way. And so I think it's important to realize how much Psalm 22 was obviously part of that very early way that Christians structured this story, that Christians kind of landed on this way of describing the crucifixion using the language and themes from Psalm 22 as a way of sort of implicitly making sense of what's going on. So just to look at these examples more explicitly. So Psalm 22 opens with, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Which is exactly verbatim the cry of dereliction that Jesus has from the cross. And this is sort of consistent, and he says exactly these words from Psalm 22, which really sort of keys in that Psalm 22 is an important part of interpreting the crucifixion. You see in verses 7 and 8 of Psalm 22 is the psalmist, the lamenter, complaining about people mocking him and his misfortune, and basically saying, if you basically saying, you were so righteous and trusted in God so much, where's your God now? Why is God not helping you now? Which is a very similar theme to what comes out in the gospel narratives of the crucifixion, right? Is the onlookers mocking Jesus and basically saying, "Come down, save yourself. If you're the Messiah, if you're the chosen one of God, call on God to save yourself." You also see in Psalm 22 the sort of language of him being thirsty, right? Poetically, "My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, my tongue sticks to my jaws." And so you also have the sort of "I thirst," and Jesus, one of Jesus's sufferings in the crucifixion is being thirsty. And then also in verse 16, in the Hebrew version of Psalm 22, it says, "My hands and feet have shriveled." And when you're looking at the Greek translation, the sort of Greek versions of these, it's often like trying to figure out a game of telephone. It's sort of like there was like someone heard something slightly different, and then it got translated into a language and becomes something very different. But if you can kind of figure this, how this happens. And in verse 16, when he's talking about "my hands and feet have shriveled," in the surrounding verses, he's talking about being hungry, being like all his bones showing. So basically all the kind of meat on his bones withering away, and him and you being able to sort of count all his bones. And so what in 16 he's really talking, the psalmist is really talking about is like the muscles in his hands, between the bones in his hands wasting away, so that you can see the kind of divots between the bones in your hands, that he's that sort of hungry and starved. In Greek, it becomes, they dug out my hands and feet. So dug out like the troughs between the bones, but that dug out word is also a word that can mean pierced, right? And so the Greek version of this psalm has, they pierced my hands and feet. And this is obviously kind of important, because in the crucifixion narratives, there are piercing Jesus's hands and feet. And it's also, it's kind of a helpful explanation of the reason. We know from archaeological remains that when the Romans crucified people, they didn't put nails in their hands and in their feet. They put nails in their wrists and their ankles, which, like, if you think about it, the nails have to hold up the weight of the body. And so, like, it would just, if you tried to nail someone's hands, it would just rip through as you're hanging there. Nailing through the wrists you get between those two longer bones of the forearm, and it actually gives you something that someone could actually be hung up from. So we know, and we see archaeological remains of crucifixion victims with nails through their wrists and through their ankles. And so why do the Gospels describe that, especially the Gospel of John, describe that as holes in his hands and his feet? Well, you have Psalm 22 talking about hands and feet being pierced in the Greek. And then also in Psalm 22, the lamenter, his tormentors are, basically foreclosing on all of his possessions and dividing their clothes amongst themselves and casting lots. And then you see that in the gospel narratives of the crucifixion, right? As that the people at the foot of the cross, the soldiers casting lots to see who would get Jesus's clothes and divide them up. And so kind of these repeated references in the crucifixion narrative, both sort of explicit, like on Jesus's words when he says the first line of the psalm, but also implicitly in sort of how the story is structured, really kind of indicates that the early Christians were using Psalm 22 as sort of a way to interpret the crucifixion and as the sort of suffering of the righteous person at the hands of people who doubted his righteousness. And I think this is in some sense a good example of what then Cardinal Ratzinger was talking about in that introduction that John read of, there's a difference between a sort of Jewish and a Christian interpretation of the Old Testament, and some of it happens because the New Testament takes on something from the Old Testament and kind of transforms it, right? Like it's really sort of impossible for a Christian, I think, to read Psalm 22 and not think of the crucifixion, right? And Psalm 22 is generally the Old Testament reading that we use on Passion Sunday, I believe, and I think it's read at Good Friday as well. So there's sort of a reciprocal relationship between the Old and New Testament here, right? The New Testament is clearly using this passage from the Old Testament to structure its story and to sort of evoke emotions based on kind of knowledge of this psalm. But in doing so, it kind of transforms what this psalm is about if read in light of the New Testament. And so, the Old Testament is a source for the New Testament, but it's also interpreted and in some sense transformed by the New Testament. And so I think, perhaps the most like consequential use of Old Testament scripture in the New, in the sense of this is describing the kind of central event of Christianity in terms that are heavily borrowed from Psalm 22. And so I'll pause there and see if there are any questions or comments about Psalm 22 and its sort of use in the crucifixion narrative.
I take it that perhaps our descriptions of the crucifixion may not match what the Psalms are saying. That we may have got a lot of the ideas from the Psalms rather than from the Romans.
Right. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that it's hard to think that this is just like an accident or a coincidence, right? That in some ways that the early Christians who witnessed the crucifixion and told stories about it structured their stories in a way that Psalm 22 informs. I think this is something that we've talked about before, is that just because a story is clearly structured on an older story doesn't mean that it's made up, though, right? Is that an older story can affect what you think is salient about the new story and what you think is worth telling or repeating or that sort of thing. So it's not sort of proof positive that like these things didn't happen, but it does sort of help us understand why would it be these details that are mentioned, and like what's the point of saying saying that the soldiers were dividing up his clothes at the foot of the cross. Like that narratively, that doesn't really do much to the story itself, but it does connect to this psalm and very strongly.
So this psalm, it doesn't end as it begins, right? It ends
Right.
a triumphant note. Is there a sense in which when we hear these words, we're supposed to think about the whole, to hear it until the end, which ends up being this sort of song of triumph, instead of just being this description of the terrible things that are happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always the sort of interpretive question of, when the New Testament is using the Old Testament, is it only using the part that it's directly alluding to, or does it want you to bring in sort of the entirety of the story and sort of assume that you're going to bring in the part that it's not talking about? And so what John's talking about is this psalm, like many sort of lament songs, ends with a kind of, he complains for most of it, and then the last couple of verses are faith that God is actually going to sort of vindicate him, and that the psalmist, despite all this laments and feeling that God has forsaken him, knows that God will watch out for him, and that he will in the end triumph. And so I think that's it's one of the interesting things about utilizing these Psalms or these Old Testament writings is it does invite that, right? It invites the interpreter to say, hey, I'm going to look at the entirety of the story. So looking at, and I think especially with the crucifixion, that makes sense, right? Is that, the crucifixion is about what seems to be a disaster, but what in fact it becomes the sort of vehicle for salvation. And so Psalm 22 is actually quite open to that too, right? Is that the first part of it is all about fortune, but then the end of it is about the faith that God will vindicate the psalmist. So yeah, I think it certainly does open that interpretive vista, but it doesn't demand it, right? So it invites the reader and the hearer of the New Testament to think about how that Old Testament story applies to it.
Thanks.
In that connection, Ricky, with the people of that time, the Jewish people of that time, have enough familiarity with the psalm that they would naturally, the first century converts to Christianity, that they would finish the psalm in their own thinking? Would it be a hard piece to them?
Yeah, I mean, it's really sort of an open question, right? Because it's really hard to know when you're looking at something that is elusive how not elusive, but elusive with an A. So alludes to things, but doesn't explicitly say them. It's hard to know exactly what an audience would have caught on to or wouldn't have caught on to. And so, I don't know the sort of exegesis of this well enough to know, like, at what point we first start seeing people kind of latch on to that idea that John said about what about the ending of Psalm 22 and how does that fit in? And much less do we know, like, how Joe early Christian convert who used to worship Zeus, how much he or she understands. But I think it's one of the I think that's in a sense a sort of unanswerable question, is like, what did these people get from it? I think what it does show, though, is like how much these kind of allusions and quotations from the Old Testament like open up interpretive possibilities, right? And so certainly for some Christians who are not familiar enough with it, that interpretive possibility would have been totally sort of over their head. But for some, it might have kind of opened and invited a lot more sort of in imagination and kind of interpretive investigation. All right, well, let's look at one other psalm that actually ends up being pretty important in the Gospels, and actually is one of the most frequently quoted Old Testament quotations in the New Testament, and that's Psalm 110. And so Psalm 110 is sort of is kind of an enthronement psalm. So it's a psalm about a king of Israel and about how great they are. And so here the first part of Psalm 110. So the Lord, and where this Bible translation, when you see Lord in all capitals here, what it is it's actually it's indicating that that's the name Yahweh in Hebrew. And so Yahweh, so God, says to my Lord, i.e. the king, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord sends out from Zion your mighty scepter, you're the king. Rule in the midst of your foes. Your people will offer themselves willingly on the day you lead your forces on the holy mountains. From the womb of the morning like dew, for your youth will come to you. The Lord Yahweh has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings on the day of his wrath. He will execute judgment among the nations, filling them with corpses. He will shatter heads over the wide earth. So this is a psalm about God empowering, a king of Israel or a king of Judah to basically be powerful and to conquer all of his foes. But you see kind of in the language here, this sort of idea of like just generally conquering everything. It's not really sort of specifically about, one particular thing, one particular king or battle or that kind of thing. And so, just as we talked about last week, where the prophetic literature sort of kind of morphs from talking about sort of one specific social political thing that God is going to do something about into like broader, more cosmic social themes of God's, of God setting things right, and especially setting things right from this by reinstantiating a Davidic king, so a descendant of David on the throne. You can see in sort of that light that Psalm 110 lends itself very well to thinking of not just about some ancient king of Judah in the past, but a sort of this future Davidic king who will conquer all the enemies, be sort of unstoppable, execute judgment amongst the nations. And so Psalm 110 is sort of lends itself to interpretation as talking about not just an ancient Davidic king, but a future one, the Messiah as well. And the other sort of interesting thing that happens is that the name Yahweh, that this version of the Bible translates as Lord, develops this sort of taboo against being spoken aloud. So that in Judaism it becomes that you're not supposed to say God's name. It's in a sense using the name Yahweh is using the Lord's name in vain. And so in this Jewish tradition, where Yahweh appears in the text, when it's read out loud, it's instead of saying Yahweh, the Hebrew word Adonai, which means my Lord, is substituted, and that's why modern Bibles tend to have the Lord instead of saying Yahweh. But that also happens in Greek, in the Greek translation. Instead of sort of transliterating the name Yahweh into Greek, it translates the word Adonai, Lord, into Greek. And so by the time of Jesus, not only do you have this psalm that is that really does lend itself to an interpretation of being about the sort of the Messiah, you also have the opening where you have the Lord saying to my Lord, and it's the same word. And so when Jesus talks about this psalm, he talks about it in that sense, where it's not Yahweh says to my Lord, but the Lord says to my Lord. And so when Jesus talks about this psalm, he's talking with people in Jerusalem. He says, how can they say that the Messiah is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool, right? So he's just saying the first line of the psalm there. But in this reading, it's a Lord, it's Lord talking to another Lord. And because this is David, presumably writing this psalm about someone else, he's calling this other person Lord. And so Jesus's response here is that the Messiah can't be sort of inferior to David, right? He's got to be superior to David. He can't be just a descendant of David and kind of recapitulating what David's doing, because in this psalm, the psalmist, who is presumably David, is calling this person my Lord. And it's also the same title as God says. So you have God, the Lord, talking to another Lord. And so this becomes a really sort of key text in the New Testament and sort of early Christian exegesis about the understanding of Jesus being the Messiah, being greater than David, and being in some sense equivalent to God, right? Because you have the Lord saying to the Lord. You have the same title speaking to the other title, but they're clearly two different people. But they're also sort of the same, at least in this language. So it's sort of like a convoluted way of thinking. But this is how early Christians sort of looked at the Old Testament and found kind of Trinitarian themes within the Old Testament. And certainly Jesus himself is looking at this psalm and viewing it as predictive of the Messiah, and talking about how the Messiah is not going to be sort of inferior to David. And so this comes up in the Gospels. This comes up in the Epistle to the Hebrews, which uses a lot of mileage of this to try to like identify Jesus's role in relation to God, in relation to kings and prophets and priests, and that sort of stuff. So it's sort of a strange way of what we would think of as a strange way of reading a text. But it was certainly very influential in early Christianity and in the early development of Trinitarian thought. So I'll pause there because I realize that it's sort of a weird thing and it might bear more questions or discussions.
I just have a quick question. Why is it that like they use that word, the Lord, there, but in the Psalms they use it different? Like, what's the latitude we have as Catholics to like how much like to really make assumptions about this like, is there only one way to see this? Because sometimes we're told that like there's multiple ways you can like interpret it, and like the Adonai part too. He uses it on the crucifixion, but like, why is that not consistent?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an example of where like Jews and Christians would definitely like read something differently. right? And it gets at to, and you can see, I mean, I've cut and paste from this Bible translation, but you see in the New Testament version, both Lords are capitalized, right? Like they're both talking about God or someone who
Oh yeah, okay, I see it.
And this one, the second Lord is not capitalized. The first Lord is all capitalized because that's the indicator that they use for talking about Yahweh. So I mean, it's one of these things where it becomes like, how do you use this language? And I think that as Cardinal Ratzinger said, we can become familiar with the sort of Jewish interpretation of this, which would be that this is not about two equal God people talking to each other, one of whom is the Messiah that's going to reign as king, but as a sort of, but as God, Yahweh, talking to a sort of human king. But Jesus certainly seems to suggest, and certain later Christian exegesis certainly wants to suggest that no, this is God talking to God, the two people of the Trinity talking to each other, and God the Father sort of empowering God the Son to be this sort of Davidic king. So again, it's sort of how you take these words and you can recognize like where people with different interpretive commitments are going to come down differently. And it's, and again, it's even things like capitalization are making some sort of statement here.
Ricky, would you bring in at this point in your presentation today, would you want to bring in John's, the phrase from John's gospel, my Lord and my God?
Yeah, I mean, so I think this is one of those, this is one of those things where it's really tricky because it comes through in all the gospels. The fact that like the word Lord, so in Greek it's Kyrie, like Kyrie eleison that we say in Mass. So Kyrie in Greek just means Lord. It can mean it can be sort of a way of saying sir, like, sir, do you want me to do this? Lord, do you want me to do this? But it's also the word that translates the tetragrammaton, the name of God, from the Hebrew Bible, right? And so there's always this kind of vagueness in not vagueness, but indeterminacy in the New Testament whenever it's talking about Jesus as Lord, or someone's talking about to Jesus as Lord. Like on the sort of lowest end, you could read that as, oh, that's just a polite form of address. On the highest end, you could read it as, for instance, as in John, my Lord and my God, i.e., like I'm calling you the thing that we call Yahweh, and therefore, you are a God, or not a God, you are God, and so it's. And the New Testament doesn't exactly tell us like how to read that, right? It's another one of these things where that interpretive possibility is left sort of open to the reader, and it takes kind of a tradition and a stance to decide when Jesus is called Lord in the New Testament, what do they mean? Because it's certainly open to the interpretation that it means Yahweh, God, the God of Israel.
Ricky, does this Psalm 110 ever appear in the Gospels themselves?
Yeah, so it appears in. I know it appears in all this. This story of Jesus interpreting it appears in. I know Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I can't remember if it's in John or not. I think it's also in Acts, and I know it's in the Epistle to the Hebrews. And I can't remember if it's in a Pauline epistle or not, but then it's definitely in a bunch of church fathers as they are developing Trinitarian doctrine. Like this is one of the key texts that they think about, that they use to think about like what's the relationship of Jesus, the Son, the Messiah, to God the Father, the Lord of Israel, Yahweh, the Lord of Israel. Mm-hmm. And this interpretation becomes really key in that.
Okay.
Any other questions about that? Yes. Hey.
Oh, am I on? No, I'm not on mute.
Yeah, I hear you.
Some suppose some Christian cults that are not necessarily mainline Christians believe that Jesus was not equal to God, the Father, the Creator. And we don't call them Christians because they don't believe that. But those are the Mormons, and I think maybe like the Jehovah's Witnesses, and then obviously the Islamic people. They think of Jesus as a really great prophet, but not necessarily God. So we get that interpretation from this psalm.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think that really this sort of key and tricky thing is, you know, in the Christian tradition is like trying to articulate exactly what Jesus is and what Jesus's relationship to God is. And I think that the Gospels are struggle to do that because they haven't invented the vocabulary to do it, right? Like that, you know, they didn't have the Council of Nicaea to like articulate for them how Jesus relates to God. And so in a lot of ways they are using the Old Testament to try to get at that. And I think Psalm 10 is one of the ways that they're clearly Jesus used it to try to articulate something about the relationship of the Messiah and David. But then Christians go on to try to use that as a way of figuring out like what exactly does it mean that Jesus is the Messiah, and who does that mean that he is? All right. So that's Psalm 110. So along with Psalm 22, I think these are sort of two of the most kind of, at least from a historical perspective, the most kind of impactful Old Testament passages within the New Testament, within the interpretation of Christianity. And so now I want to move to the other book of the writing that I think is really crucial in the Gospels, and that's the book of Daniel. So the book of Daniel, we like in the Christian Bible, it's grouped with the prophets. It's grouped with like Ezekiel and Isaiah and Jeremiah. What the book of Daniel, though, is probably one of the latest written books in the Old Testament, which is probably why it didn't end up in the group of books called the prophets. Right? It was probably like by the time Daniel was around and was getting sort of recognized, like the idea of what the prophets were had already sort of congealed, and so that's probably why Daniel had to be part of the writings. And Daniel being later kind of participates in that, and again that transformation of the prophetic tradition from being about sort of concrete socio-political problems at a particular time and place to being about sort of the cosmic battle of good and evil in the last days that becomes what we call apocalyptic literature, like the book of Revelation. So the book of Daniel is actually sort of, in a lot of ways, a lot of it is very similar to the book of Revelation. It's there's the parts about like the lion's den and the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. There's like those parts that we teach, elementary students about. But most of the book of Daniel is actually visions of this sort of apocalyptic nature, these really sort of highly symbolic visions about kind of cosmic battles between good and evil and about what's going to happen in the future. And it's all, it's very sort of mysterious and open to a lot of interpretation. I will say, for instance, so Sir Isaac Newton, after he had invented calculus and discovered gravity, he spent like the last third of his professional life trying to interpret the book of Daniel. And that was not like, book of Daniel interpretation is sort of like book of Revelation interpretation of like, that there's some sort of like deep knowledge there for people that can interpret it correctly, because it's this sort of apocalyptic, highly symbolic stuff about the kind of nature of good and evil and God's ultimate plan for the world. And so one of the like what ends up being one of the really important visions from the book of Daniel is about these two characters called the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man. So in Daniel 7, Daniel is talking about a vision where he sees this person, this old man, this giant, powerful kind of white man with a old man with white hair and a beard, sitting in kind of enthroned in heaven with everyone serving him. And he calls this figure the Ancient of Days. So again, you get this very sort of symbolic language, Ancient of Days. I don't know, what does that mean? I don't know. It sounds like cool and mysterious, but that's what Daniel calls this. And so this really pretty clearly sounds like God, right? So it's God kind of enthroned in heaven. And then along with this person that's called the Ancient of Days, Daniel goes on to say that he sees one like a son of man. Okay, so son of man, what is that? In Hebrew and Aramaic, which is the sort of successor language to Hebrew, son of man is sort of like a flowery way of saying a human being, right? It's sort of like a poetic and elaborate way of saying a human being. So for instance, and it's actually often like hidden in Bible translations. So if you look at the book of Ezekiel, when God talks to Ezekiel, in most English translations, it will be something like God will call Ezekiel something like mortal or human being. But what God is actually saying to Ezekiel is son of man. There's this, I can't remember which psalm it is, but what is man that you are mindful of him, the son of man that you whatever. So like son of man is just kind of a flowery way of saying a human being. And so Daniel is basically saying, I watched one that like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. Okay, so here this one that's like a son of man looks like a Messiah figure, right? God, the Ancient of Days, gives this son of man power to kind of rule and have dominion over everything. And so, one like a son of man, or the son of man in Daniel is this sort of character that goes along with the Ancient of Days. So, you can call them God and the Messiah, or you can call it the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man. So Jesus actually latches on to this vision of Daniel when Jesus is talking to the disciples about the future and about what God's going to do, and specifically about what he is going to do. And he talks about then, I took examples from the 3 synoptic gospels, but reading the one from Matthew, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So he's clearly alluding to Daniel here, this character, the one like in Daniel who's called one like a son of man. Jesus just calls him the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. This picture of the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven is really directly from Daniel, and that's what Jesus is using in these in this passage that is also repeated in Mark and Luke to talk about himself and his own sort of future coming to the disciples. So we have pretty clearly this link that Jesus is thinking of himself and his sort of future coming as the character, this messianic character from Daniel's vision there. But it's also notable that this is where this link is made most explicit. But Jesus actually uses the Son of Man quite a bit in the Gospels to talk about himself, right? And so this is too small for anyone to read, but it's just to indicate to you how much Jesus in the Gospels talks about himself as the Son of Man, right? So one of Jesus's favorite phrases for himself, and especially when he's making predictions about what will happen to him in the future, is to call himself the Son of Man. And so where does he get that from? He's getting it from Daniel, right? He's adopting this figure from Daniel that's described as one like the Son of Man who's going to come on the clouds in glory. and he's sort of using that as his own self-identification. So every time he's talking about himself and calling himself the Son of Man, or the Son of Man must do this, or this must happen to the Son of Man, he is inviting his hearers to think about this vision from Daniel of the Son of Man coming on the clouds. And so this is actually, probably by if you count every time that Jesus talks about himself as the Son of Man as being a quotation from Daniel, then this is probably the most quoted Old Testament Bible passage in the New Testament, right? And so this is really key to Jesus's, self-identification, interpretation of himself. And then, as you can imagine, becomes hugely important to Christians' interpretation of who Jesus is as the Messiah, and as the one who is sort of empowered by God to bring a reign of peace. And then you can even think of Revelation as sort of a retelling of much of this stuff from the book of Daniel, but making it more explicit that it's Jesus who is the one that is coming on the clouds of heaven. And so it's not Daniel, again, it's just this one passage from Daniel, but it becomes hugely important within the New Testament. And it's actually, I think, really a really key thing to understand this, to really hear what is the implications are. All of these, probably 50 times at least, that Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. If you don't know Daniel, the Son of Man just sounds like this sort of weird thing. But if you know Daniel, it keys you in to that identity as the messianic figure empowered by the Ancient of Days. And so that's all I have for Daniel, but I figured that was important enough. So any questions about the Son of Man stuff?
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead.
At Jesus's trial with the chief priests, Jesus says he's like, what, he can see the Son of Man coming on the clouds, or
Yeah.
in some way it was a blasphemy. But if Son of Man means just a human being, then there's no blasphemy. Right.
So, I mean, that's the thing. This is also like a very Jesus thing to do, where because Son of Man can also be just like a flowery way of saying a human being. Then you can take any of Jesus's sayings about a Son of Man as being sort of just about him as a human being.
In the church, can I call you back in about 10 minutes?
But it invites you to look at it as, hey, I'm this character from the book of Daniel. Again, it's one of these things where the Old Testament allusion invites an interpretation but doesn't demand it, and so it's sort of left up to the reader and hearer, like how are they going to take Jesus calling himself the Son of Man. So it's a very Jesus thing to do, is to say something that's sort of provocative, but he doesn't completely explain what he means by it, and invites you to try to figure it out.
You said that in the Gospels, Jesus called himself a flowery way of saying, I'm a man, I'm a human. And yet I've always heard in my biblical studies that he and when he said Son of God, that wasn't nearly as meaning God as Son of Man. They used to say that was his way of calling himself God. But now it seems like you're saying he's just claiming to be a man in a flowery way.
Well, you can read it that way, but you could also read it as he's claiming to be this character from the book of Daniel who is messianic and rules over the world forever. Right.
Oh, the Messiah.
Yeah. Right.
Oh.
And so his use of the phrase Son of Man invites you to look at it in either way. But if you're familiar with the book of Daniel, and especially since he talks about, him coming on the clouds in glory, like the character of the Son of Man in Daniel, it really invites you to look at all the other times that he's talking about the Son of Man as indicating that. And also he talks about the Son of Man. He doesn't talk about like a Son of Man, right? So when he's if you substitute human being, it still is like kind of a weird way of talking about yourself, for so that you may know that the human being has authority on earth to forgive sins, right? And so he's clearly using it as some sort of title for himself, but he sort of leaves it in. There's some ambiguity of what that title is actually trying to indicate.
Okay, Ricky, this kind of relates to my question last week, but you're saying that, this is what Jesus said. But again, the other interpretation would be that this is how the early church understood him and put these words on his lips.
Yeah.
So are you basing the assumption that Jesus used this term on how often it is showing up in scripture? Is that sort of that?
Well, yeah, I mean, so I think one is how the fact that you have Jesus doing it this many times in all four gospels would seem to suggest that like this idea of that Jesus called himself the Son of Man arose pretty early, right? That it arose early enough that it would end up in all four gospels.
Right.
And it certainly does seem like something, it certainly seems reasonable to think that this is something that Jesus would say about it, would say about himself. We never know we never know for certain what Jesus actually said and did versus like what early Christians said that Jesus said and did. But this is something that happens like so much. And it's not like you see this, it's not like this Son of Man stuff is such a big part in other like early Christian stuff that we would think like, oh, they just sort of were retrojecting this back on Jesus. Like Paul is not like full of talking about like the Son of Man this and the Son of Man that, the way that Jesus in the Gospels is. And so, I think it's pretty reasonable to think that Jesus talked about himself, or at least talked about the Son of Man coming and talked about himself in those terms.
And therefore saw himself as this figure from Daniel.
Yeah. Again, invited people to see himself as this figure from Daniel. I mean, that's the thing with so much of Jesus's language is kind of, now I am talking about elusive with an E, elusive, like it's both elusive and elusive, is that it harkens back to a lot of Old Testament stuff, but doesn't sort of nail you down to just like one way of looking at it. Right. And so I think that the Son of Man stuff does that. The Son of, certainly he could have landed on this as sort of like a kind of flowery way to talk about him, to talk about himself or about, himself as a human being. But it could also, it is also very open to him, consciously connecting himself to this figure from the book of Daniel.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for presenting this series of talks. Boy,
Yeah,
that's really good.
well, this is kind of, this is all the slides that I had. I was just going to kind of, in the last few minutes, just sort of kind of give a sort of summation of these last 3 weeks, which is, we've looked at the way that, all of these elements, the law, the writings, and the prophets figure in to the Gospels. And I think sort of 3 really kind of key points that sort of come up again and again. One is that these Old Testament writings are in one sense, the sort of language and grammar that the New Testament writers are using to tell their stories of Jesus, right? Is that they are using the structures, the characters, the ideas from the Old Testament to write their stories about who Jesus is and what he does. And so that really the Old Testament provides the way of talking about things that the gospel writers use to talk about Jesus. And I think the second point that's like that is that Jesus himself as a character in the Gospels, and as far as we can tell as a historical figure, was also using the kind of language and grammar of the Old Testament to talk about himself, what he was doing, what he was hoping for, connecting his sort of calls to Israel, to faithfulness to the law, his identity as one who is doing much like what the prophets are doing, but is also connected to this messianic hope for the redemption of Israel. So I think that the Old Testament becomes really important for sort of Jesus's articulation of who he is, what he's doing, and what he asks people to do who want to follow him. And that sort of both of those points lead to the third point, is that the Old Testament is just really, really crucial to understanding the New Testament. There's all sorts of like other ancient writings and ancient Jewish writings and ancient Greco-Roman writings that are like interesting kind of background to the New Testament. It might help us, a scholar see some minute point or something like that. But the Old Testament is on a sort of different level and is really sort of foundational to what the New Testament is trying to say. And I think it makes, knowing about the Old Testament and what and kind of the events, the characters, the stories, the themes from that, I think it makes it really crucial for Christians to know, because I think if you aren't familiar with the Old Testament, you miss a lot of what the Gospels are saying, or a lot of these, as John mentioned earlier, the sort of interpretive possibilities that the Gospels and the whole New Testament has because of its reliance on the Old Testament. So I think we're probably at time, and I'll pause there. And I'm happy to stick around and talk more, or John, if you want to wrap things up.
Yeah, I think we can offer a hard stop for those who need to run off, and anyone else, feel free to linger for a few moments, either put your questions in the chat and we can read them, or just chime in. But again, thanks, Ricky, for helping us to unpack these themes. And I have no doubt that we'll ask you to come back and talk sometime about something else.
Great. Thanks again for having me.
Mm-hmm. Other questions, comments, where to go from here?
Thank you, Ricky. I learned a lot. Got me thinking.
Thank you, John and Ricky.
Yeah.
Ditto,
Thanks so
John.
much.
Ricky. Have a good week.
I'll always take more of this. Mhm. Bye-bye.
I have a question.
Sure.
If I don't know why I'm getting all this feedback, but anyway, what's a good way to start studying the Old Testament for those of us who grew up basically not studying the Bible at all, and to get a good background so that we can, if it's crucial, which I agree it is crucial to understanding the New Testament, where would be a good place to start for the regular Catholic in the pews?
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, it's a good question, and I'd have to. I'm not like an expert on Old Testament pedagogy to like tell you, oh, this is the one book to read. Although I will say, just reading the Old Testament, I think, is an important, important thing, and I think that. It's not just, I think this is not just like a Catholic thing. I think this is a sort of widespread Christian thing, is that most of Christian education, it's sort of like the Old Testament is sort of what you learn about in like elementary school. And then you kind of stop talking about the Old Testament, like, because the Old Testament has better stories, right? It has like David versus Goliath. It has, marching around the walls of Jericho and the walls come tumbling down. Like the Old Testament has these stories that you can tell that are sort of more arresting for children. But then we kind of stop. Yeah. But then we kind of stop like reading or really thinking about it. I think once we reach adolescence. And I think just reading the books of the Old Testament, and one is sort of reading them as an adult, and there's actually quite a lot of adult material in the Old Testament that you're like, oh, they didn't tell me about that, and when I was an elementary student. But I think especially the narrative books of the Old Testament. So like Genesis, the part of Exodus that's narrative, you know, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. You know, those things are like, I mean, they're not, you know, it's not like a, it's not like you're going to be like a bestseller list, but these are things that you can read for yourself and like see the story going on. And especially if you have like if you have a study Bible that has, you know, like footnotes and stuff like that, that can kind of clue you into like, what is this weird thing? That can be helpful. And I think that's, I mean, if there's one thing I was encouraged, I would say, you know, read the Old Testament, and, you know, the narrative ones are easier to read. Like, you know, it's reading the you know, all of the regulations from Leviticus will probably put you to sleep. But the stories you can read, and I think that also gives you the sort of, the stories are really also like the framework for when all the other stuff, right? So like knowing what the prophets are talking about relies on you kind of knowing the stories of you know, Israel and Judah, and that sort of stuff. So that would be my suggestion.
There's a great book. Well, it was great when I read it, but that was 15 years ago or so, by James Michener, a famous novelist, called The Source. And he kind of tells the stories about the origins of Judaism with what was available to him at the time. But I remember a dialogue in there where someone was asking, I don't remember if it was a rabbi or a Jewish studies scholar, but the question was, I need to read something to help me understand Judaism. And his answer ends up being, read Deuteronomy 5 times in a row. Read it 5 times. You know, first to get everything out of the way, and then just over and over to see, you know, kind of what is central. But I've never tried that, but
yeah.
Michener says so. So
yeah, no, I mean, I think Deuteronomy is also good. Deuteronomy is good because it's like, it's a story with a lot of interpretation around it, right? Because it's Moses telling the Israelites, hey, remember that we did all this stuff, and like, remember what's going to happen when you come into the promised land. So I think that probably is like a good one to get. You know, you get both narrative and sort of theological interpretation like all together in a more sort of explicit way.
Ricky, I have a quick question. I missed last week, but John sent me the recording. But this goes back to the first week, and we just touched upon it. But I'm just wanting clarity about with Leviticus. I read a little bit more of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And was Moses the one that gave the consequences to the law and commandments?
You mean like in terms of like, if you do this, then this will happen to
Correct.
you? So I mean, it's sort of, I mean, it's sort of a loaded interpretive question of like who you think wrote the 5 books of the Pentateuch, right? So the traditional interpretation has been that that Moses wrote those 5 books, which is pretty impressive because Deuteronomy talks about his death. So that's a pretty impressive thing to write about. But you know, if you don't, so the one way of looking at it is like, well, this was Moses listening to God from Sinai, telling like, these are the consequences, and so like, this comes from God, written by Moses. Now, if you're not gonna sort of buy into that sort of traditional interpretation of it, then it's really sort of a historical question of like, where did these things come from, and like how did these regulations, you know, evolve over time, and who developed them. And a lot of that is, I mean, honestly, is speculative, right? Because the evidence that we have is just the books themselves.
Right.
And so that's, you know, but I think that most biblical scholars, right, in a sort of academic sense, would look at these as having developed over time in Israel, as the sort of like basically law of the land that then in some sense became codified and recognized as a sort of like holy law that was then passed down.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Do Orthodox Jews think Moses wrote the Pentateuch?
I mean, that's still the sort of traditional, like traditional dictum and interpretation. So I mean, but you'd have to ask like your own particular Orthodox Jew whether they believe that or not. But me, my dissertation advisor is an Orthodox Jew, and she doesn't believe, she doesn't think that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. But I remember her telling me that her children who went to Orthodox school growing up were like talking to her when they went to college and being surprised about like these ideas of that people other than Moses wrote the Pentateuch. So it's still sort of like the traditional teaching. And there's certainly, Christians who would say that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, David wrote the Psalms, like that these traditional attributions are still right. But,
Thank you.